Thank you. What are your thoughts on a bunch of different things, such as one, alcohol, two, coffee, three, tea, four, vinegar, those four things: alcohol, coffee, tea, and vinegar, in terms of health?
Well, we know that alcohol is toxic and it promotes pretty much every cancer in every single organ system in the body. I love a good glass of wine, so it's all about moderation, but I know Alan will argue about that, but
Mm-mm.
not good, not good. No amount of alcohol is safe. That's the actual truth. There's even I wrote a book on the Mediterranean diet, and even with all of that said, it's not a health promoting food by any means. About coffee and tea, I talked about today. There's more and more evidence supporting these wonderful things about coffee. I mean, I'm drinking tea, I drink coffee, all of the phytonutrients, the chlorogenic acid. There's some really promising benefits to consuming coffee and tea, and in different ways. And I think that it's a wonderful food. It's what you add to the coffee or tea that can be problematic. Vinegar, lots of wonderful benefits on vinegar. Add them to your salads. Don't eat it whole. Include it in your dressings and sauces, and it's a wonderful food to incorporate as well.
So some of the vinegars that are used today are more soda pop vinegars. If they've got more than 10 calories per tablespoon, you know that what they call it grape mist, it's sugar that's added to it. Sometimes 1 tablespoon of vinegar will have 2 or 3 times as many calories as the entire salad, just because of the amount of sugar that they're putting in there. So if you're going to use vinegar, you probably want to just use vinegar and not necessarily the ones that are sweetened excessively, the soda pop vinegars. Tea and coffee. I wouldn't have any problem with tea if you can eat the plant comfortably. So your mint and all your mild stuff. As far as caffeine, though, I see it as a highly addictive nervous system stimulant, much like alcohol. So I don't recommend that we take things that you can become addicted to, like caffeine and alcohol. What was the other thing?
Alcohol, coffee, tea, and vinegar.
Yeah. So, again, it's not the vinegar that's the problem, but it's the stuff they put in the vinegar in order to make it taste like soda.
Okay, you recommend an SOS-free diet: salt, oil, sugar. So if someone says, totally with you, I'm not having any sugar, what I use now is I use monk fruit, lucuma, yacon root syrup, maple syrup, honey, agave, and molasses.
Right.
How are they, that is, what do you, when
So
you say no sugar, what
something
do you?
Yeah, something being less bad doesn't make it good. So honey is twice as sweet as sugar, so you would need less of it in order to approximate the taste. But my first question would be, what are you eating that you need to sweeten? The truth is, on an ideal whole plant food diet, we wouldn't have to be processing foods to the point where we've just eliminated their natural flavors and have to be sweetening them. Most people that are sweetening, grain products that they processed excessively, and they're trying to make something that will appeal to you after you've already eaten and don't really have any appetite left. So it has to be ultra stimulating. I would suggest avoiding sweeteners. Now, again, is honey less bad than sugar? Sure, because there'll be less of it. Unless you're a child and get botulism and die because of it. So with the little infants, you don't want to be feeding them honey. I think even the standard sources of advice caution against children's exposure to honey. But in any case, the point is that the principle is eat foods that are whole foods, not processed foods, and you won't need to be sweetening them in order to be able to enjoy them.
1,000,000%. And then also, you can go with the World Health Organization recommendations. You want to keep it under 5%, or they say 10% of total calories, added sweeteners. But the truth is that you could really shift your palate if you get away from them. And that's what's so extraordinary, is that if you're coming from a standard Western diet, it's like they can't imagine not having anything sweet. So then you can,
Right.
what you could do, and what I do with my clients is I taper it down. So you're going from, especially like artificial sweeteners, which are hundreds or thousands of times sweeter than table sugar, and I take those away first, and then we start adding things like whole food sweeteners, like I would use date syrup, but that's my favorite sweetener of choice, or fruits by themselves, or fruit purees if I'm baking or cooking something with that. In my dressings and sauces, I use those things, and then you're all of a sudden that starts to taste sweeter and sweeter and sweeter, and then myself included, and I've walked hundreds of people through this. All of a sudden, things get too sweet, and sometimes even fruit becomes like really, really sickeningly sweet sometimes. So your palate will shift if you give it the opportunity to do so and stick with it.
We actually did a study on that on taste neuroadaptation. We showed that the literature is clear. If you go on a low salt diet, it takes about a month to neuroadapt to a low salt diet. If you go on a low fat diet, it takes about 3 months to satiation adapt to a lower fat intake. With fasting, it happens very rapidly. And what's interesting is people come in and the whole natural foods are disgusting, tasteless swill. And then by the time they're done fasting, they're not bad. And they'll eat the chard and think, oh my gosh, you're putting salt on the chard. It's the same chard. It's just now you can detect it. And we've shown that in our study that the actual detection of salt and sweet changes, and it changes quite rapidly with fasting, to where you can detect minimum threshold to salt and sugar at a lower temperature. And the hedonic response to food changes, just like you're explaining, that good foods start to taste good, and that the foods you used to like are overstimulating, and you don't need that level of stimulation anymore. But that never happens as long as you keep putting salt or salt substitutes and phony sugars and concentrated sweeteners on things. If you just get away from it all, let your body neuroadapt, all of a sudden you like fresh fruit and you like vegetables, and you don't need all that highly processed fractionated crud. And then the other thing that happens that people don't appreciate is when you eat sugars, even some of these natural sweeteners that are concentrated, your insulin levels go up, it drives your blood sugar down, now you get cravings. And a lot of this cravings and binging and problem people are having controlling what they put in their mouth is because they're screwing up their biology with hyper-concentrated sweeteners that's affecting their insulin response. And so, one of the things that we see with fasting is it reduces insulin resistance, and now the diabetics can function without the medication, and the people that are having addiction to cravings and binging and all this problem gets to be a lot more controllable because they're not fighting biology, they're just left fighting psychology.
Here's a weird fun fact. This is a total anecdote, but I've noticed with my clients repeatedly, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this. One dose, especially after they've been off the hyperpalatable foods, I've seen one dose, one serving, one pizza, one last a week increased in appetite and cravings.
That's because they're addicts. It's just the same thing with alcoholics. They're artificially stimulated to dopamine production in their brain that comes from the artificial chemicals added in their food, the salt, oil, and sugar. If you take an alcoholic and you say, oh, a little bit won't hurt, or just have some beer on the weekend, the next thing they know, they're waking up naked under the Golden Gate Bridge wondering how they got there. And the same thing happens with people that have vulnerabilities. If they have a little bit, then it leads into a cascading cycle. Now, can some people have a drink and not become a drunk? Sure. But if you're an alcoholic, it's not you. Can some people have a chunk of cheese and a bit of chocolate cheesecake and whatever and not get into craving? Sure, there are people like that. But if you're overweight, it's not you. If you could have controlled it, you would have controlled it. You can't and you don't, so you got to stop lying to yourself and stop putting the chemicals in your mouth that are fooling your brain. If you're an alcoholic, the only answer turns out to be figure out a strategy to not drink. And if you're struggling with weight, the best strategy is go on a whole plant food SOS-free diet and figure out a way to stop fooling your brain with these chemicals that lead to the cyclic problems that you're having that are making you fat and sick.
What about stevia? Is that an exception, or is that similar to the others?
No. Same principle. Because it's lower caloric density, you may not get fat eating the stevia itself, but the consequence of the stevia in the food that you're putting it is still going to lead to the same issues. Lack of neuroadaptation to healthy diets, overeating of the more concentrated foods. I just tell people if they really want to know if they should have something, all they have to do is get very quiet and go inside themselves and say, do I really, 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 really want whatever it is? And if the answer is truly yes, they know they can't have it. They get nothing.
Is there... Go ahead.
The stevia and all of those artificial sweeteners or naturally whatever you want to call them, they're hundreds or thousands of times sweeter than table sugar. So what it does is it raises that threshold of desire for sweetness. And my clients that can't get off of this stuff, of sweet and craving, the cravings for the sweet are driven by all of them the same.
Which is great if you're a food manufacturer, because you put these chemicals in the food and then you can supersize the people. And then as they get bigger and bigger, they can eat more and more.
Is there any clear information on how to prevent dementia, Alzheimer's, and memory loss?
Well, we know at least part of dementia is a progression of atherosclerosis, and we also know that it's tied to oxidative damage in the brain. So you want to start thinking, like, for example, in rats, these are genetically bred rats in a cage, exactly the same, fed exactly the same, except that half the rats are given a wheel where they can exercise. The rats that exercise don't get dementia. And they said, why? What is it about exercise that keeps those rats from developing dementia? And they found out that one huge difference is that rats that exercise have much higher levels of BDNF. BDNF is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor protects the brain from oxidative damage. So even if the rat's being given the rat chow that promotes oxidative damage, if they have high BDNF with exercise, it mitigates the damage so that they don't get dementia. And it turns out there's two things that increase BDNF levels, exercise and also fasting. And if you take those same rats and you periodically fast them, they live twice as long. You double their lifespan. And so they're realizing that a lot of the changes that occur with exercise also occur with fasting, which seems not obvious because, in fasting, you're resting, exercise, you're vigorous. Why would these both have the same effects? And the reason is probably because both exercise and fasting undo the consequence of dietary excess. And it's dietary excess that leads to fat, that leads to visceral fat, that leads to inflammation. The inflammatory products are what cause the dementia, the oxidative damage in the brain and the dementia. So anything you do to get rid of visceral fat and to reduce inflammation is likely to have an ameliorative effect. And that is true with exercise. It's true with fasting. It's true with eating a whole plant food SOS-free diet. So if you'll find the likelihood of dementia in patients that are raised on a healthy diet is going to be much less than people that are on a pro-inflammatory oxidative damage diet, smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol. All these things that lead to pro-oxidative damage are going to increase your odds, not just of dementia, but dementias included.
If someone is perfectly healthy, how often would you recommend they do a fast with you? Once a year, once every 2 years, once every 5 years? How often?
Well, that's a really good question. We recommend actually that everybody fast every day for between 12 and 16 hours. That we recommend they not eat 3 to 4 hours before they go to sleep at night, and that they limit their feeding window to that 8 to 12 hours, during which time they exclusively eat whole plant foods. Now, we also recommend that periodically, and depending on the patient may determine the duration of the period and the periodicity, that maybe once a year for a week, they do a proper medically supervised fast, during which time we can assess both the benefit of fasting, but also you can use it diagnostically. If you can fast for a week, everything's stable, that's a pretty good sign. And that's what I do. That's what my staff does. We fast for a week a year. If everything's good, we're done. If not, we'll continue to fast long enough to resolve whatever the problems that might show up.